It's hot outside. It can lead to heat exhaustion or a heat stroke. And Dr. Frank McGeorge is an ER doctor and sees this type of thing at the hospital. He talked with Bryan Schuerman about techniques that doctors use in the ER to help in the heat.
Hi there, everybody. We are talking the extreme heat once again, our next heat wave moving into southeastern Michigan. And with that comes a lot of problems that could happen if we're going to be spending a lot of time outside in the heat. Joining me to talk more about it, our own Dr. Frank McGeorge. Dr. McGeorge, thanks so much for joining me.
Of course.
So not our first heat wave this year. And I remember back to the first one, 5 days right when summer started. You joined us by phone on Sunday morning because you had just gotten out of the emergency department. And we weren't even 24 hours into the heat wave, and you said you were already seeing problems. So in my mind as a meteorologist, kind of gives a little more, oomph to what we're saying here and why this discussion on what we should do when it gets this hot is ever so important.
Oh, sure. So the first heat wave usually carries some significance because people's bodies haven't acclimatized or gotten used to it. Our bodies normally change certain things like the way we sweat, the way we even behave, actually, but there are physiologic changes that occur. So the first heat wave can be particularly dangerous, but when we have these long gaps between heat waves, later on, you can still face some significant problems like we probably will tomorrow.
And with this, it's not just spending time outdoors, it's making sure you're prepared for all of this because we've got a lot of people who work outside. We were talking with Karen Drew and some of the people in the newsroom earlier. Schools are getting outside now because we're getting into the summer practice window for fall sports. There's a lot to keep in mind on what we should be prepared for. So the big thing, obviously, we've talked about heat exhaustion.
Right.
Why is it important and what are some of the signs of heat exhaustion?
So, heat illness is kind of a spectrum. So people can initially just feel crummy because of the heat. So you feel, flu-like almost. Your body is achy, you're tired, you're sort of just, a little extra fatigue, maybe a little bit of a headache. Those are sort of the earlier signs of heat exhaustion. Now it can get a lot worse, actually. So as you become more dehydrated, you can develop heat cramps and some other illnesses. But heat exhaustion is kind of a vague general term for that initial, basically really icky feeling when the heat is starting to get to you and you're getting a little dehydrated. You're maybe getting a little bit warm. Your body's starting to warm up. You're sweating a little bit more and your body's just not coping as well as it should. And really the best thing, if you can recognize those symptoms, is to get out of the heat, get into some shade if that's the only thing you can do. Drink more liquid. Cool liquids actually do work a little bit better than warmer room temperature liquids. And basically get your body temperature down and cool off. Now, some people that are working outside, they may not have that option. They'll be sweating bullets. If you're sweating bullets, you're getting more dehydrated. So you just need to remember, if you're sweating bullets, if you're soaking your clothes, that is, if you wring it out, there's actually something that would drip out. That is that much fluid that you are losing, not to mention there's what we call insensible losses. So as you're breathing, you're actually breathing out liquid as well. So that's kind of the basic idea of heat exhaustion early on. It's just kind of that punky, weird, icky, flu-like feeling.
Let's talk about the body's response to this, more into the science of this. When we get the temperature and the dew point, that gives us our heat index. So we normally say in the dew points, 60's feeling uncomfortable, 65 is tropical, 70 is stop the ride, I want to get off.
Yeah, right.
You toss in 90 degrees or better, that's why we're getting into this situation. But our bodies are not able to respond as fast when these numbers get this high. Why?
Yeah, so the most effective way that we cool ourselves off is actually through sweat. We evaporate the sweat off. That evaporation cools the skin temperature, and that's what basically cools us off. The thing to remember about that is a couple. First of all, the different parts of your body sweat differently. So there's gland sweat and there's what we call cooling electrolyte sweat. The sweat that if you're like sweating like bullets, that is actually not effective sweating. That's just fluid loss. The key is if you're sweating bullets, you need to actually, it sounds icky maybe, smear that sweat around to create more surface area that can evaporate. That's the main thing. And that's why when the humidity is high, you don't evaporate that sweat off effectively. It just turns into basically bullets that drip off your face. And that is not an effective way to cool. That's just an effective way to get dehydrated. So you really need to make sure that, when you have sweat on yourself, spread it out over as much surface area as possible, and then get it to evaporate by basically fanning yourself and getting it to whiffed off. That's the biggest way to cool yourself.
So some of the things we see when we're carrying the fans and we're just trying to cool off that way probably are some of the most effective besides getting into the air conditioning.
Absolutely, it works. And the other thing I really should point out, when people are wearing a shirt that is just drenched in sweat, soaking wet, that is also not effective. You should actually remove that soaking wet shirt and put something on that's going to be lighter and that's going to be breathable, because if it's a soaking wet shirt, it's not evaporating, so it's not actually cooling you. So you want to have something on that's light, that's going to allow air to pass through it, that will evaporate more effectively. So that's kind of another interesting thing, like cotton garments that just become drenching wet, not very effective.
And we normally say light colored, loose fitting clothing. You've mentioned this in the first heat wave. You need to start drinking water and those electrolytes before the heat sets in. So really, it should have been done at least a day or two ago, but even then, a lot of water, no alcohol, things like that when the temperatures soar like this.
Yeah, pre-hydrating is actually really important. So if you know you're going to be outside, or you know you're going to do some strenuous activity where you might be sweating a lot, a couple of hours before you go outside, you actually need to pre-hydrate. Make sure that your tank is full, literally. Your blood system is basically a tank that holds liquid. It's plasma, but in that plasma there's fluid, and you need to make sure that as much of your body has the appropriate level of fluid in it, so that when you do start sweating, you have some reserve to draw that tank down, and then you can refill it as you're getting dehydrated or as you become more dehydrated. If you don't pre-fill that tank and you start off a little behind, once you get out there and you start dropping that tank level, you're just going to get dehydrated that much faster. And basically, the effects are going to be more profound.
Let's talk about the kids, though, on that same line here. Those that are out in this heat, in the sports practice and everything, maybe a little more vulnerable because they may not be starting off with that full tank either, and they're not as big as we are as adults, so they need even more attention right now.
Well, that's exactly it. Basically, I think, most kids underestimate it. They just don't realize that this is a problem. And so it's really incumbent on parents, teachers, whatever, coaches, to tell them they need to pre-hydrate and make sure that they're on them to drink consistently. Because even though kids are thirsty, they have sort of I'm going to say, wishful thinking, where they're just like, oh, it's not that big a deal, I'm not going to worry about it, but they don't realize that they're actually getting further and further behind, and that is putting them at risk. And if anything, if it's a sports event, for example, they're just going to have suboptimal performance. So if they want to do really well out there, they need to make sure that they're staying hydrated and keeping up with their fluid losses. And that's where parents, teachers, coaches come in.
And there's one more group we need to talk about here, our elderly friends and neighbors, and those, much like myself, as we've been talking about. I have asthma, respiratory illnesses, folks with those, very vulnerable when we get this extreme heat. What should we be doing? What should I be doing right now to make sure I'm not getting, overwhelmed when I'm outside in this heat?
A lot of it is kind of the same thing. It's keeping up with fluids. It's cooling yourself when you need to be cooled off. In the case of respiratory issues, the heat puts an unusual strain on your cardiovascular system, because basically, as your cardiovascular, your blood volume begins to shrink, the fluid in your body begins to decrease as you're sweating and losing fluid. Well, that means that your heart has to pump harder. If your heart is pumping harder, that's putting more strain on your heart, but it's also actually putting more strain on your lungs. So it's putting more strain on your cardiorespiratory system, and that is going to, in the case of an asthmatic, or in the case of someone with, let's say, heart failure or underlying heart disease, that's going to increase their risk of worsening. So it may not be fatal, but it's going to make them very uncomfortable, and it does have the possibility of tipping over their process into something that is much worse than we would like.
A lot to talk about and a lot to think about when we go out in these temperatures and everything. Dr. Frank McGeorge, thank you so much for joining me. Obviously, a very important topic to talk about. We still have a lot of summer left, and we even see 90s we hit once school goes back, late August, early September. So.
Yeah, and a final thing I would point out, we're making a fuss about it because the heat index is going to be 103 or whatever it is. But the truth is, just on hot, humid days in general, even if it's just 95 hot and humid, you should pay attention to the heat anyway. You don't need a big red flag to say, hey, heat's bad.
Yeah, a few days ago, we were still into the 80s, and heat index values are into the 80s. I'm stepping outside, and I'm like, oh, it's still hot out here. So it doesn't take a heat advisory or a forewarned weather alert day for this, but just good common sense as we head into the summer.
100%.
Dr. Frank McGeorge, thanks so much for talking with me this morning. We appreciate it.
Pleasure.
We'll send it back to you.